So, welcome to our 8th meeting, and it's a very special meeting because it's my great indeed a privilege to welcome back our Honorary President, Margaret MacMillan, who's got this illustrious career that you've been reading out for several months. Some of you will have met her on a previous occasion here in the Westminster. Some of you may recall that she was one of the speakers during that period of the pandemic, when we were World Affairs Digital, and it's wonderful to welcome her back again. I first encountered Margaret through listening to the radio and the BBC Wreath Lectures, which was a wonderful experience, and that would have been back in 2012, perhaps, around about that time?
Yes, sometime around.
Yes. And since then, she's graced us with her presence and has always been the epitome of the modern historian, enlightening us and making us think in a broader world about in a broader way about the difficult world in which we live. So once again, we welcome her and look forward to her talk about war and the modern world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Bill, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out on a night which makes me think of Canada. Very, very thoughtful of you to arrange for me to feel right at home here. Thank you so much. I hope the driving will be okay. My subject tonight is probably not going to take your minds, well, it may take your minds off the weather, it may not cheer you up that much, and that is war and the modern world. And I want to talk about war because it is something that runs through so much of our history. And it's something that we are confronting again today. We're beginning to have to think, or we've already well on the way of thinking, about how we try and bring war under control, how we try and prevent future wars, where wars are likely to happen. And of course, we have very close to hand the example of the war in Ukraine. But there are a great many wars going on elsewhere in the world, and have been since 1945, when the Second World War ended. War affects the ways in which we speak. We use metaphors for war. We talk about a war on drugs. We talk about wars on various kinds of ills, social ills. We use the metaphor of war. President Trump is constantly urging his followers to fight, fight, fight. It's something that runs through our language, I think, sometimes without us even being aware of it. I'm going to use, however, not the broad definition of war, which people who use such metaphors are using. I want to keep it narrow because I think there is something very specific about war. I want to look at violence, organized violence, highly organized violence. As one anthropologist once said to me, war is one of the most organized of all human activities. When you think of what it takes to organize a war, to prepare people, often to go against that very basic human instinct of wanting to survive, to be prepared to risk their own lives, be prepared to take the lives of others. When you think of the tremendous effort that can go into preparing and supplying for war, I think that's what I want to focus on, that highly organized activity, using violence. But it's not random violence. It's not the sort of brawl that you might get outside a pub or at a football match, although sometimes football matches do get more organized and you actually get people turning up in uniforms who do behave in organized ways, but it's that organizational side of war. It's the application of violence to try and achieve what particular end it is that you want to achieve, whether it's to defend yourself or to take something from someone else. And Clausewitz, the great German theorist of war, described war as the application of organized violence to force your enemy to do what you want, whether that is to submit to you or to stop attacking you or to give you something that you want. And I think, curiously enough, although war is such a feature of our history, and then people here will have had, if not themselves, they will certainly have had family members who experienced the Great Wars and have experienced other wars since then, it is something that we haven't studied all that much in our universities. It's something that the public is interested in. If you ever go to a bookshop and look for the books on war, they'll go on for shelves and shelves. look for books on peace and you won't see nearly as many. It's a very short, usually a rather short section. I think we haven't perhaps taken the study of war seriously enough, certainly in the universities, because for most of us, we've lived through a very peaceful period in our history. This is not true of everyone else everywhere in the world. As we know, there's been a major war, civil wars, other kinds of wars somewhere in the world every year since 1945. But war has, for the most part, not come close to us and not affected us very much. I mean, some of us will have family members who've gone to war. Some of us may come from countries where there have been wars, there have been invasions, there have been civil wars. But if you live in the fortunate part of the world, if you have lived in the West, if you've lived in those parts of Asia, Latin America, the Americas in general, Europe, certainly Western Europe, you will have been spared the experience that so many generations have had of having war. And I think perhaps as a result of that, what sometimes historians call the long peace since 1945, even though it really hasn't been a peace, we've perhaps come to think of war as an aberration, as something that only happens when societies break down, when something goes badly wrong. Or we've come, I think, and again I speak for us living in the West, we've come to think of war as something that other people do. We don't do it. It's other people in other parts of the world who do it. Nevertheless, I think, we're being made to realize yet again just how important it is to study war. We're living, I think, at a particularly turbulent time in recent history. As an historian, one of the things I study, historians are interested in them, are turbulent times. I wish I wasn't living in one. It's something I'd like to study safely in the past, but we are living in a time which some people have invented a new word to describe, a world of polycrisis, a world of too many things happening at once, overlapping crises. So these are crises of conflict, but also crises of domestic societies, loss of faith in institutions, economic crises, and of course looming over all the great threat to humanity of climate change. So that we are living at a time when you have many different sources of unease. And we're seeing also, I think, a breakdown, and we're seeing it certainly in the way in which Russia's been behaving, and other countries as well, a breakdown of international rules, but also the unspoken international agreements, the norms of international behavior, which you don't have to spell out, but you just sort of know they're there. It's what's done and what is not done. Those rules, those norms are, I'm afraid, breaking down. For example, since 1945, there has been an understanding. There's no formal treaty, although it's referred to occasionally in documents. There's no formal treaty, but there has been an unspoken understanding that one state cannot take territory from another state by force, that the taking of such territory by force will be regarded as illegitimate. And we're seeing a breakdown of that norm. We saw it when Russia invaded Georgia and took away some pieces of Georgia. We saw it when Russia invaded Ukraine before the present invasion and took away Crimea. We're seeing it again, of course, with Russia's present invasion of Ukraine. We're seeing it in the Middle East, where Israel has asserted its sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which belong to Syria. So far, only the United States has recognized that sovereignty. Other nations haven't. But I think we're seeing a weakening of that unspoken and unspelled out sometimes prohibition against seizing territory by force and being able to stake out a claim to it. And so I do think we need to understand war. We need to understand previous attempts of how to prevent war, how to regulate war, and how to end war. I'm an historian, and so I think history is very important for helping us think about the present. It's not going to give us clear answers. When people talk about history's lessons as if there's a neat book you can pick up and you get all the lessons of history laid out very nicely, no, it doesn't exist. History doesn't offer lessons, but what it does do is offer understanding, and I think that's important. We can't deal with other peoples, we can't understand the motivations of other peoples unless we know something of their history. I think you have to understand something of the history of Russia, both recent but the deeper history of Russia, to understand why President Putin is acting the way he does today. You have to understand the history of the United States, and again, not just the recent history, but the deeper history of the United States, to understand American attitudes towards the war. History can help in understanding. It can also help us ask questions. And again, that's what the study of war can do. History can ask the what-if question. What if we decide to declare war on someone? What is likely to happen? What if we decide to invade another country? What is likely to happen based on what we know about that country and based on what we know of previous invasions? How is a war likely to end, given what we know in the past about how wars have ended? And so history, I think, helps us ask questions and offers us useful warnings. It can't offer us a clear path ahead, but what it can do is give us some help as we try and think about what is, I think, a particularly complicated war. We don't know how far war goes back in human society. The evidence is that it goes back quite a long way, at least to the beginnings of recorded history and possibly before. Anthropologists and archaeologists are pushing back the boundaries of what we know about the very distant world of the past, of what we know about the earlier stages of humanity, before they had settled down into farming communities, before they had begun to find ways of recording what they were thinking, what they were feeling, and creating historical and other records. And what it does seem likely, certainly, there's no firm proof of this, but as anthropologists and evolutionary biologists examine things like ancient DNA, which they can now do, as they discover graves which have skeletons which bear the marks of trauma, which suggests that they were killed forcibly and possibly in a conflict, we can at least guess that conflict among organized groups, whether those are in the past, whether those were family-based groups or tribal groups or eventually more organized, bigger types of societies, we can imagine reasonably that fighting is something that goes back a very long way, and perhaps even before we had any capacity to record our history. And so I think we probably have to accept that war is part of who we are. Not necessarily. We're not condemned to fight. And I think there's a lot of argument, quite rightly, among those who study war. Do we have an impulse to fight? Are we naturally a violent and warlike people? Well, we have lots of characteristics as humans. We also have characteristics which are about benevolence, about kindness to others, about altruism, about loyalty to others, about wanting to protect others. So I think we can't just look at our evolutionary makeup and say, oh yes, we're bound to fight. Again, I go back to my point that war is something very organized, and turning people into those who want to fight and prepared to fight takes a great deal of training. That's why the military do it. You can't just pick out a whole lot of people at random and say, you're now an army. It doesn't work like that, and they won't be a very efficient army. And so all I would say is that I think war is deeply intertwined with our societies, that it goes back perhaps longer than we would recognize and like to think. But that doesn't mean it's inevitable, because we've had long periods of peace in our history in different cultures in different parts of the world. We had a long period of peace in Europe in the 19th century, perhaps one of the longest periods of peace. There were a couple of wars in the middle of it, but not anything on the scale of the Napoleonic Wars or the two great world wars that were going to come. So that we have had periods of peace. We are capable of peace. We often long for peace. We've tried repeatedly to bring peace about, to try and prevent wars from happening in the future and try and stop them once they've started. And so we do have this very, very complicated relationship with war. Sometimes we glorify it. You know, you can all think of the great war paintings, not so much from the First and Second World Wars, but the wars of the 18th century, which show often very decorative soldiers lying neatly on the ground who are dead. They don't show the horror of war, and they often show triumphal marches. They show emperors, kings, dukes on horseback. You think of the many statues and paintings of Napoleon. There's a famous painting by David of Napoleon crossing the Alps on his way to Italy, which was one of the scenes of his first great victories. And Napoleon is riding a magnificent horse and galloping through the Alps. In fact, the painting, like a lot of these propaganda paintings, was completely false. Napoleon rode very grumpily on a very small mule, bitching and complaining the whole time about the weather. It was probably rather like this, and he was not a happy person. But this was the image, the great glorious emperor and the glories of war. But even then, there were those who showed the other side. There was Goya, who did this wonderful series of etchings called The Horrors of War. They were so graphic and so terrifying that he didn't release them in his lifetime. They were found after he died, and it showed the brutal face of war, the cruelty, the misery. So while we've glorified war often in our arts and our culture, we've also shown the other side of war. War affects not just the arts in society. What it also affects is the very nature of societies itself. It's been argued, and I think I believe it, that we became more organized as a species when we became agriculturalists. We settled down, we began to cultivate foodstuff, we began to tame and cultivate domestic animals. What that meant was that we're able to build bigger and more complicated societies because there was now a surplus of food. But what it also meant was that someone living near us might want to come and take it, that we were more vulnerable once we'd settled down. When we were still largely nomadic peoples or hunter-gatherers moving around, if we were menaced, we could move away. Once you have settled down, once you've built buildings, once you have stores of food, then it's much more difficult to move away. You do so with much more difficulty and much more reluctantly. And so I think coterminous or co-synchronous with the development of agriculture, the development of more complex societies, we also had the need for those societies to defend themselves or to take from other societies what they wanted. So it's never been, as far as I can see, a one-way street. What you get is societies becoming more organized. As they become more organized, they get better at war. They get better at organizing their young to fight, putting them into groups, training them to fight. They also get better at developing and amassing the sorts of resources that you need if you're going to fight a war. And so as societies become more organized, they get better at war. As they fight more wars, they can grow even more powerful. And great empires are built very largely on the development of war. And so it's not a one-way street. The development of more complex societies, the development of more organized societies, has made those societies better at war. And it's been argued that in the case of Europe, for example, that the development of strong central governments was very much both the product of a need to make war. And kings in the Middle Ages often had very little power. Power resided with their feudal lords, who lived often in fortified dwellings, castles of various sorts. Once the central authority, the king, began to develop his or sometimes her own forces, they were able to overcome these local magnates living in their highly fortified castles. As they developed more power, they could do more taxing, they could build bigger armies, and so it went on. It was, as I say, an intertwined sort of relationship. The better the organization, the more access to society's resources, the better you got at war. You could fight war more efficiently, you could fight war with better weapons. And so the strong centralized state was both a product of fighting war, but it was also something that contributed to better wars. The very nature of societies also affects the sort of wars you fight. In the Middle Ages, when those who possessed, if not a monopoly, but certainly possessed the most important weapons, the knights on horsebacks, the swords, these were all very expensive. I mean, it's been estimated that it would take a very large farm indeed to keep one knight on horseback and in armor. But you had not that many who fought, but you had people who fought very, very effectively. But as societies moved to becoming more democratic, as they moved into the 19th and then 20th centuries, they became less hierarchical and more people were expected to join in. And I'll explain why that was so in a moment. You also, I think, began to get new kinds of weapons, new kinds of fighting. The 19th century was going to see the emergence of what came to be called total war. And there were a number of reasons for that, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I think you have to see war as something that is always changing. As the societies that change, so too do the ways in which they fight. If it's a more democratic society or a society in which more people think of themselves as citizens, then they have an obligation not just to choose their own governments, but they have an obligation to defend those governments. And so the expectation, as we became more democratic, as we became more involved in our own government, the expectation was also we should be prepared to fight for our countries in ways that wouldn't have existed in the earlier period when rulers and those in charge didn't want ordinary people learning to fight. They felt it would be a very bad thing indeed. But as you got changes in society, then you got changes in the way that we fought. What also affected war, of course, was changes in technology. What you have available will affect the ways in which you fight. And so the movement from bronze weapons to iron and steel weapons was going to make war more deadly, was going to make it possible to fight ever more destructive and brutal wars. The introduction of the horse, which arrived in Europe from Central Asia in the millennia before the birth of Christ, was going to make war different again, because it was going to get it off the ground onto horseback, and people riding in horses or driving chariots pulled by horses could be much more mobile and could often affect terrible damages on those who were on the ground. Eventually, those who remained with their feet planted firmly on the ground became better at dealing with that. They learned how to deal with it. And in medieval Europe, again, they had to learn it all over again. You also got, of course, as time went by, more and more deadly weapons being introduced into war. Gunpowder, which was developed somewhere in China, began to reach Europe in the 13th and 14th century, was going to have a huge impact on the ways in which wars were fought. Just to give you one example, you've probably all seen medieval castles, which are often very beautiful with very high walls. Well, very high and rather thin walls are not very good once cannonballs start flying at them. And so the castles that are then developed in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries are much lower with much thicker walls. And so there's a constant process of the introduction of new technology and the adaptation of society to it. What you also get is the adaptation of existing technologies for war. And we're seeing it recently with drones, which were, for many people, a toy before the war in Ukraine, or were used for looking for traffic patterns, used for picking up signals on the grounds. Drones have now become a very significant part of modern warfare. And it's something that I think has taken a lot of people by surprise. That the drone, this plaything, this thing that was a civilian thing, has now become a very important tool of war. And what drones are doing is rather what happened before the First World War with torpedoes and mines. They're making very vulnerable, very powerful, very expensive things like tanks and like aircraft carriers. Suddenly, these weapons which dominated, that technology which dominated, now is much, much more vulnerable. And the process of technology goes on and on. I mean, we've moved in really a comparatively short time from gunpowder to nuclear weapons. What also happens, of course, is that war moves into different environments. And so in the 19th century, war moved from just being on land on the surface of the sea. It moved under the sea. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, it moved into the air. And now it's moving, of course, into cyberspace, but it's also moving into space itself, which I think is a very, very worrying development. Even as war takes over civilian technologies, of course, it modifies them, changes them, and often will come up with things that then come back and are used in civilian society. Again, it's never a one-way process. It's a two-way process, a constant reinforcing, reusing, reimagining things that come either from the experience of fighting wars or from civilian societies. Just to give you one example, which I've always liked from the Middle Ages, one of the problems when gunpowder was introduced was getting strong enough vehicles for the gunpowder, that if you didn't have a solidly made cannon, or you didn't have a well-made rifle, this was before rifles, you didn't have a well-made musket, the danger was that it would simply explode as the shot went through it. And one of the reasons Europeans were very good at making cannon that didn't explode, which of course would not only be inefficient in war but kill those who were manning the cannon, was that they were very good at making church bells. And church bells have to be able to withstand a lot of banging. You have to have good metal for them. And in the same way, we see things that are developed in war or added in war coming back into civilian society. You think of the things that, as a result of the First and Second World Wars, came to change our societies. The introduction of battlefield treatment, the introduction of plasma, which made possible great advances in medicine. Where I live in Oxford, there's a sign on a wall, one of those blue plaques, which says, "Here was the first successful use of penicillin in 1941. It's on the wall of what used to be an old hospital in Oxford. And penicillin had the father of antibiotics, if I can put it like that. Penicillin had been discovered and isolated before the Second World War, but it was too expensive to produce. And so there was no one prepared to invest in it. With the coming of the Second World War, suddenly it was no longer too expensive. It was rather like the vaccines during the COVID pandemic. What was too expensive in ordinary circumstances suddenly became essential in extraordinary circumstances. And so huge advances in medicine were made and have been made during war. We wouldn't choose to do it that way, of course. It's highly inefficient, but it has made possible advances that have in fact benefited civilian societies, as has the development of aircraft, the development of transistors. These things were developed initially largely for war, or they were moved ahead largely by war, but they have become part of civilian societies. The big changes, and why we start talking about modern war, came really, I think, in the 19th century. There were already changes occurring in war. States were already becoming more efficient, more effective at organizing themselves for war. And Britain was a very good example of this. And by the 18th century, it had a hugely expensive navy, which was the basis of much of its power in the 18th century and later on. And it had had to find ways of paying for the navy. And so the British state, in turn, became very efficient. It became very efficient at collecting resources, mainly through the excise tax, but other ways as well. And they developed also, the British did, a very efficient bureaucracy to make sure that the money being raised for the Navy was being spent on the Navy and being spent properly. Because the one thing you don't want is to build very expensive ships which then sink because they haven't been properly caulked, or the ropes that they have are rotten. And so you get the beginnings of a modern approach to war, if you want to put it that way, a sort of highly bureaucratic way of dealing with war. But it's really, I think, the 19th century that brings the changes that have made war as we understand it today. And I think that several of these. One, of course, is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, and people living in and near Stoke-on-Trent know what the Industrial Revolution is about. You have evidence of it all around you. But what it does is make possible vastly increased production, so that it's possible to produce repeated types of the same material. So, for example, you can produce repeated wheels, for example, through the Industrial Revolution. You can also produce repeated guns. And you can make guns in different parts. It means that they're all standardized. If a bit of the gun gets broken, then you can bring in another part that will fit. And so where guns were once made by hand, whether these were cannon or the infantryman's weapons, these now become mass-produced. It also is possible to feed and put uniforms on an awful lot more people and to move them around. Because with railways and steamships, it's now possible to move armies around, move very large armies around, also to keep them supplied. Before the 19th century, if you sent an army into a field, you basically couldn't send enough supplies with it for it to stay for more than about a week, and then it would have to live off the land. And armies in the 18th century and earlier were like locusts. They'd come in, they'd eat a neighborhood drive, and then they'd have to move on. In the 19th century, and we see it in the 20th century, it's possible to have much larger armies and keep them there for much longer. That's why we get campaigns that last for 4 years in the First World War, whereas in the 18th century, campaigns tended to be 1 or 2 battles and over very quickly. The Industrial Revolution also brought with it literacy, increased literacy, so you had better educated people going into the military. It brought urbanization, so more people were living in large communities with a sense of belonging to a larger unit. And it brought nationalism. It brought a sense of belonging to a larger unit than you might otherwise have felt in the 18th century. And the French Revolution had something to do with that. In my view, the French Revolution helped to change the French people, or French men mainly, from the subjects of the king to citizens of the Republic of France. And that led to what I mentioned earlier, the sense that they were part of something which they also had to defend. And so we had the way being paved for very different, very large-scale wars. What hasn't changed, I think, is the reasons that nations or groups of people, organized groups of people, go to war. I think it goes right through human history. I mean, one of the reasons that Sparta and Athens went to war in the Peloponnesian Wars was because Sparta was afraid of the growing power of Athens, as the great historian Thucydides said. And this is something that has always been a factor in war, the fear that someone is getting stronger than you, that they might wish you ill, fear that they might take something from you, fear that you are, as a group, under threat. Self-defense is one of the strongest motivating forces in war, or fear that someone might be about to do something, so you attack in advance so they can't do it. Simple greed is also a factor in war. I think it's very much a factor there in Putin's attack on Ukraine. Ukraine contains some of the richest soil. Most of Russia is not very good farming soil. Ukraine was, when it was part of the Soviet Union, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and Putin and other Russians feel that loss. And so I think greed, wanting to get your hands on something, whether it's loot, whether it's land, whether it's slaves, is something that drives wars. I think also ideas. People are often highly motivated to go to war by ideas such as nationalism, this new emotion that appeared in Europe and elsewhere in the world in the course of the 18th century and 19th centuries, and of course on into the present, that we're somehow part of this much larger organization called a nation, which has a right to defend itself, a right to look after itself, a right to protect itself. But there are other sorts of ideas. There are religious ideas, that if you die in a religious war, if you die in the Crusades, if you die in a holy war of some sort, you will get special treatment in heaven. You are dying for a greater cause. And I would put in that as well ideology. There were those who were prepared to die for either fascism or communism because they felt it was a much greater cause than they were. And I think there's also a fourth factor, which I've been thinking a lot about since the Ukrainian war, and that's because you think you can get away with it. Putin thought that he would take Ukraine in about a week. And you all remember pictures of that long column coming down towards Kyiv. And it suddenly stopped, and we all said the Russians are doing something very devious. They've suddenly stopped. Why have they stopped? Well, they stopped because the Ukrainians had made it impossible for them to go on, and they couldn't go back. And in that long train of trucks and cars, when the Russians finally fled, Ukrainians discovered the dress uniforms that Russian officers had brought with them for the victory parade in Kyiv, which they thought would be about, less than a week after they came over the border into Ukraine. And so it's often not just one or the other things that make nations go to war, it's a combination. And so you'll get a mixture of greed and religious fervor, for example. The young men from places like Normandy and Britain who went off to join the First Crusade were doing so, yes, because they thought this should help to recover the holy places of Christianity. But they're also doing so often because they were younger sons who weren't going to have much of a life if they stayed at home and weren't going to have much of an estate. And so motives can often be mixed in war. Funnily enough, when we do go to war, and this again seems to be something that goes down through the ages, and we certainly see it today, we seem to want to justify it. We seem to want to make sure that we are presented as doing the right thing. We appeal to morality, to law, to history. And there is, in fact, a very large body of law about when war is justified and when it's not. There are a whole lot of theories that have developed over time. War is justified, said St. Augustine, if it is for a good cause, if you're defending yourself against annihilation. So you get ideas, but you also get justification being used very cynically. I mean, again, I have to keep going back to President Putin because he exemplifies so many things about war and the misuse of war. But he has appealed to morality. He was coming, do you remember, originally to save the Ukrainians from a drug addict bunch of criminals who were running the country. And when that didn't work out because the Ukrainians didn't appear to want to be saved from their own government, he then said the Ukrainians themselves were a dreadful bunch and riddled with corruption and riddled with the wrong sorts of ideas and needed to be reformed. But the fact that he wants to justify it, I think, is interesting, that there is this need to want to appear to be doing the right thing. What people like Putin do, and Hitler did it too, is they also will manufacture incidents to make it look as if they're being attacked. Hitler's war on Poland in September 1939 started with a completely fake raid that German troops and prisoners of war dressed in Polish uniforms did on a German radio station. And this, for Germany, was the justification to invade Poland and take it over. We keep on trying, and it may seem ridiculous, to make war more civilized. We try to limit it. We try to limit the targets. We try to say that civilians shouldn't be attacked. We're doing it. We continue to do it in spite of all the examples where it clearly doesn't work. We try also to insist that prisoners of war be treated decently. And we're still talking about it today. I mean, the Ukrainian government is gathering evidence. Whether it will ever use it is another matter, will be able to use it is another matter, but the Ukrainian government is gathering evidence that it will be hopes will be used as the basis of charges against the Russians for violating the laws of war about the treatment of civilians and about the treatment of prisoners of war. We've tried to limit the sorts of weapons that are used. Before the First World War, it was, among other things, poison gas. And we're still trying to limit the use of biological weapons, of chemical weapons. So we keep trying. I mean, I think we have a sense, an innate sense as human beings, that some of the things that are done in war are even more wicked than the other things. I mean, there are very often not things that are done that can be described as good in wars, but we do have a feeling that some are even more reprehensible and blameworthy. We also look at how to end wars, and this is something, again, we've done for centuries. I mean, some of what we see in war is very new, but some of it is very old. And we're still finding, as Putin is finding and others are finding with the war in Ukraine today, for example, that it's easier to start a war than to end it, and that war itself, by its very nature, is unpredictable. Once you start it, you don't know where it's going, and you often can't bring it to an end. And quite often, nations will start a war without really thinking about how they end it. I think most of the nations that went to war in 1914 hadn't really thought about how they were going to end it and what would happen if it ended in stalemate rather than the decisive victories that they hoped for. And then when we get into a war that drags on, as we're seeing in a number of the wars today, how do we get both sides to agree that the war should be stopped? And the problem is, as the losses, well, there are a number of problems. One of the problems is, as the losses mount, it's harder and harder to want to forgive your enemy, harder and harder to want to come to any sort of agreement. It also is often the case that where one side might be willing to negotiate, the other side isn't. The timing is crucial here. And if one side wants to negotiate and the other side doesn't, the side that doesn't want to negotiate will often think that the side that offers to negotiate is weakening, that they have a chance at final victory. And so war is something that once out of the control of the people who started it is very, very difficult to end. And then when wars finally do end, we face, and we have faced throughout history, how to deal with the peace, how to build a peace. St. Augustine said that the object of war should be peace. But so often people who make wars, those who make wars, and all of us don't really think about how we make peace. And I think it's extremely important. I mean, how do we build a peace that will last, that will not be the grounds for other wars? We've also tried, and that's, I think, partly because of the work done in the 19th century, a sense in the world that war was something that should be put behind us as human beings, that there had been such evident progress in humanity through the Industrial Revolution, through the spread of communications around the world, that war was something that should no longer be used as a tool of state. We've always tried to prevent wars. We've tried it when the Greeks were fighting each other. We've tried it in different parts of the world over the centuries. But I think the pressure to try and prevent wars has grown with the weapons and the size and the costs of war. And so there have been repeated attempts from the time of, well before the First World War, but certainly from the time of the First World War and the Second World War, to try and find a way to make sure that nothing like this will ever happen again. The League of Nations came out of the First World War, and its purpose was very clearly, it was designed to provide collective security for its members so that anyone who wanted to attack a member of the League would think twice because they would be coming up against a very strong opposition. And it was also designed to try and push measures that would make wars less likely, such as disarmament. It didn't work. We know that there was another great war that started in Asia in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and in Europe in 1939 with the German attack on Poland. And that Second World War was even more destructive, cost even more lives, cost not just the lives of soldiers, those fighting, as was the case largely in the First World War, but cost huge civilian casualties as well, because the weapons, the aircraft, the bombs now made it possible to reach civilian centers and inflict enormous casualties. And so out of the Second World War, and they did a lot of very serious thinking about this during the Second World War, the Allies, came the United Nations. And the United Nations was set up very, very specifically to try and prevent war. Its first line of its preamble says, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind." And what the United Nations did was hope to improve on the League of Nations to be a stronger, more effective body with a Security Council at the heart, which would contain, as its permanent members, the big powers of the time. But what it also tried to do, much more thoroughly than the League had tried to do, was remove the causes of war, get rid of some of the inequities, the inequalities in the world, deal with disarmament efficiently, effectively, get rid of the sort of rapid competition to develop more and dreadful weapons. We know that hasn't worked. It doesn't mean the attempt itself is wrong. In fact, I think it's more important than ever before, because we're now facing a world in which we have incredible capacity for destruction. Weapons get better all the time, they get more accurate, they get ranges that will hit around the world. Kim Jong-un has just been testing a rocket that could hit the United States. And from what we know of Kim Jong-un, he's not someone you want to have. I mean, he shouldn't really have a slingshot, much less a rocket with nuclear weapons. Just to give you one statistic, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the only time that atomic bombs have actually been used in war, the bomb that dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, and the one on Nagasaki was 20 kilotons. Today we have bombs that are 80 times that. Those two bombs destroyed two large cities. So imagine something 80 times stronger. And there are at least 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world, probably more. It's very difficult to count because nations will hide them. What we're also seeing is a rapid evolution in war, perhaps more rapidly than we expected. We're seeing the possibility that war will move out of human control even more than it has done so in the past. Artificial intelligence is highly significant for war, and so far the powers which are developing it for war have not been able to come to any agreement on how it should be used. We have already autonomous weapons systems which will fight on their own. Where is the human control? How do we stop them? We do, I think, run the risk of weapon systems that will get out of control and simply continue to fight, not paying any attention to the costs, why would they, of what it might mean for human beings. We also have a world which is, as I say, troubled. It has a series of crises. We have points in the world which are highly sensitive. The South China Seas, the fate of Taiwan, these are things that are causing real trouble, I think, between the United States and China, and these are two very big powers. And what concerns me, I was in Washington fairly recently where I do a seminar once or twice a year for mid-career military on the history of war, and they're very good. They're ideal students because they do all the reading, and they always call me ma'am, which I think is very nice. But one of them said, we were talking about preparations or thinking about war in both Beijing and Washington, and he said, well, when we fight China, we may find this. And I said, you just said when. And he said, yeah, I could have said if, but we all say when these days. And I think that's a very dangerous sort of thinking. And it's sometimes, as we know with the First World War and other wars, it only takes one small incident to set a war off. What we also have, I think, is a weakened international order, an international order where some of the prohibitions I mentioned, some of them unspoken against seizing territory by force and being able to keep it, are being weakened. And the impact of such actions by rogue states is dangerous because others will copy. The importance of example, the importance of someone getting away with something will be something that others will note around the world. And if you want to get into looking at claims to land, almost every border in this world can be debated, can be discussed, especially if it's a part of the world with a very, very long history, recorded history. There will be overlapping and multiple claims, as there are in the Middle East, to the same parts of land. And so we're dealing with a number of crisis points. We're dealing with an explosion, I think, and certainly a rapid development of our capacity to inflict damage, and a really worrying situation that we may not be able to control some of these new weapons. And we're also dealing with a weakened international order. The UN has not proved to do what its founders would hope, and we have now statesmen, people like Putin, who simply ignore the international order. And we have in the United States a president. It's not clear yet, the new president, President Trump, re-elected, what he will do, but he often talks like an American isolationist. The United States, he says, can look after itself and the rest of the world can look after itself. Well, we've often complained. I'm Canadian. We always complain about the U.S. But we've complained about the U.S., but it has been the world's policeman. And a world without a policeman may not be a sort of easy world to live in. Let me just finish with two quotations. E.O. Wilson, the great biologist, evolutionary biologist, said, and I think he's right, he said, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. He said, I find it terrifying. And I'll leave you with one last quotation from perhaps an unlikely figure, Leon Trotsky, the great Bolshevik revolutionary, who said, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and we'll get on with the Q&A as promised. And I understand that outside the weather is no worse. So, and Gillian asks, if a country is invaded and fights back to defend itself, is that country going to war?
It's at war. I don't think it went to war. I suppose it's a semantic difference. I mean, I think most people who write about the justification of war say that self-defense is a good argument and a reason. And if you feel that your whole way of life, your family, your friends are facing an existential threat, then I think you are justified in going to war. There are those very hardline anti-war people like Mahatma Gandhi, for example, who say that you should never fight under any circumstances. He said that if the Japanese wanted to invade India in the Second World War, the Indians should welcome them and try and persuade the Japanese that they were wrong. I think most of us wouldn't do that. I think for most people, you probably think there's a point at which you probably have to fight.
Graham Smith has touched on your discussion about thou shalt not invade a neighbour's and take land from a neighbour. And he says, well, he assumes it's not a historical norm, so he wondered where it came from, how did it arise, and why is it now failing?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not quite sure where it came from. I mean, it used to be that conquest was regarded as the basis for a claim in peacetime and one that would stick. And so up until the 18th century, you would get one nation, Prussia, under Frederick the Great, would invade another nation, seize its land, and it would become part of Prussia. And that was accepted. I think what began to change is the notion that the people who actually lived on that piece of land had some say in where they lived. The whole notion of self-determination, which was certainly there at the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the First World War, really changed that view, that conquest was no longer to be regarded as a legitimate way of taking and maintaining a piece of territory, that if you conquered a piece of land, you would either be forced to give it up or no one would recognize that you actually had the right to that piece of land. It was coming, I think, already in the 19th century. It's quite interesting how nations that were acting like conquerors and carrying out acts of conquest began to try and find other reasons. And history often came into this. They began to find historical reasons that this was always ours, really, that the people who currently have it shouldn't have it. History has become more and more important as a basis for land claims. But for someone to say today, I'm conquering it because I want it, would be regarded as not a valid reason. So other reasons have had to be found. But it was beginning to go out of, there are fashions in international relations, even fashions in war, and it was beginning to go out of fashion in the course of the 19th century. And the more we got the notion that people had a right to their own destinies, to who ruled over them, what country they'd like to be part of, I think the more illegitimate it became to conquer. Even Saddam Hussein, when he took over Kuwait at the beginning of the 1990s, came up with some rather flimsy historical excuse that in the 18th century this was always a trading port for Iraq. Well, Iraq didn't exist in the 18th century, and it was not a very good excuse. But I do think it is just something that we tend not to recognize. But I don't think, is anyone going to say to Putin, you've got to give back Crimea? I don't think so. If a settlement comes with Ukraine, it will probably recognize that Crimea is now part of Russia.
Dave thinks that proxy wars seem to be more prevalent in recent times. So speaking as a historian, I suppose you say he says, if so, why? Is he right? And if so, why?
I think proxy wars where great powers fight through allies is something that's gone on for a very long time indeed. You've had it, well, we had it in a way in the Balkans before the First World War, where Russia and Germany supported different parties in the Balkans and used it as a way of testing weapons and testing tactics. But perhaps with the Cold War, proxy wars became almost inevitable because the two superpowers possessed the capacity to destroy each other utterly. that famous acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. And so they didn't want to go to war directly against each other, but they wanted to try and push each other out of certain parts of the world. And so, yes, I think proxy wars were probably fueled or helped to spread further by the Cold War itself, because it was too dangerous for the adversaries to go directly against each other. I think what we're also seeing is something that's been around for a very long time, is the use of mercenaries, those who are paid to fight. And the British have always used them. I mean, they had Hessians fighting for them in the American War of Independence. This was something, you could argue the Gurkhas, in a sense, were mercenaries. They fought because they were paid to fight, and there were other reasons why they fought, and I think they felt the British treated them better than some of the other people who might have employed them. It's interesting that Gurkhas are now fighting for the Russians in Ukraine, apparently not being treated very well. But mercenaries have been around for a long time, and the Wagner Group, of course, those dreadful people who have been fighting in Ukraine and are causing such misery in parts of Africa are out-and-out mercenaries. We disapprove of them, but they've been a part of fighting for a very long time, and in some cases, some bits of the past we haven't disapproved of them. It's just been something you did. You just hired people to fight for you.
Cultural, I suppose I'll call this a cultural question from Jeff Elliott. Why are we humans so in love with uniforms, military uniforms in particular?
Yeah.
For example, the royal family. And what does it tell us about our love of glorious war?
Well,
we've got to be careful here. You've got a wonderful honour, and you sit next to King Charles III and so on and so forth. So you might want. Do you want me to withdraw the question?
No. I'm Canadian, so I can take a certain latitude, I suppose. No, I wonder if it's partly, it's something I haven't thought much about. I mean, there is a sort of glamour to war, and the uniforms are often highly symbolic. They often bear the colors that were won by different units at different times. And so I think there's something of that about it. But I think perhaps we also admire the military because we think in some way that they're better than the rest of us, that they will do things for the nation, that they are prepared to go and fight and die, and that they have virtues that perhaps a lot of us wish we had and don't know that we don't have. And I think we do, a lot of us admire the military because there are many sides to the military, but there is a side which is something that we admire, that people doing their duty and doing what they can to obey the orders, sacrificing their lives often for their comrades or for a cause. I think we admire that. So possibly mixed in with our feeling about uniforms is partly the glamour of it, the history of it, the rip-roaring tales that those uniforms can often show. I mean, it's perhaps the same reason why we like marching bands and military music, but perhaps also because we think that there are military virtues which we rather admire.
I've got a couple of questions which are a little bit unlike, but if you don't mind, I'd like to couple them together. Susan says it feels as though warmongering is part of the human condition. How much do you feel religion is most often the core cause, or inverted commas, justification? Ian Brown takes a different tack. Have we lost one of our, inverted commas, moderators, in that wars used to be fought face to face, whereas now it's more impersonal or remote?
Okay, let me take the second one first. And I think, yes, it's probably easier to feel some sort of empathy for the person on the other side, funnily enough, if you're fighting face to face. I mean, one of the things that comes out in so many of the memoirs of wars like the First World War is that those who are actually in the trenches often felt a sort of sympathy for the people on the other side because they knew what they were going through. And you did get those spontaneous truces at Christmas, for example, when the troops from both sides would come out and shake hands and sing Christmas carols together. And so perhaps there is a sort of fellow feeling, and you certainly get it in the memoirs that, someone kills someone with a bayonet and looks at them and realizes, it's probably some poor creature like me who's here, doesn't want to be, has a wife and children. So that's possibly easier to feel that empathy. The further away you are, the less, of course, you feel it. And war has always had a long-distance element. And once we got gunpowder, it became possible to fire at people over increasing distances or to knock down city walls and so on. But I think with the increase of modern weaponry, the long-range artillery, by the time of the First World Wars, they had guns, go in some cases 50 miles, that they could send shells for 50 miles. It's hard to feel empathy, or harder, I think, to feel empathy for those you can't see who might be killed by your shell. And then, of course, aircraft also remove you from the actual, seeing the actual and experiencing the actual consequences of what you've been dropping on the ground. And now, of course, we have people sitting in Nevada or Arizona or we have people in Ukraine and Russia who are often miles away, sometimes hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles away from the targets they're actually targeting. And so I think in those circumstances, it perhaps is more difficult to feel empathy. Now, the second question, wait a minute, which was?
Religion.
Religion.
Yes. Is it really the driver?
I think religion can be. Like any ideology, I mean, religion is, I suppose, different from, perhaps you wouldn't call it an ideology, but any system of thought which says you are doing something for the greater good, or you're doing something for the paradise to come on earth or in the afterlife, is a very powerful motivating force. And I'd put nationalism in there as well. I mean, with nationalism, if you look at the way in which people talk about the nation, they often talk about it in religious terms. The nation will be born again, the nation will rise again, the nation will be resurrected. I mean, these are borrowings of religious terms, and they can be a very powerful motivating force. You're doing it to build a better world. You're doing it for the future. You think often that if you die in this cause that you will get some sort of reward. You'll get a reward in heaven, or you will get some sort of sense that you're contributing to this greater cause. And so yes, I think religion, indeed all those sorts of systems of thought, which cover ideologies based more on the here and now, can be very powerful. But we also know that religions can also be a very important force against war. And some of the leading anti-war organizations and groups have been religious groups, like the Quakers, for example. And so it is a very powerful motivating force, and people will do great good in its name, and they'll also do great evil in its name. Often I think it's a distortion of the religion they claim to be responsible for, or claim to be trying to promote. But that doesn't mean it is any less powerful as a motivating force. We know that people like to feel part of something much bigger than themselves, be taken away from their own worlds, and feel that they're contributing to something absolutely huge and important.
I've got a question that's often asked at Keele World Affairs, and I suspect is often put to you, and you may well have written a book about it. John Mottram, could you speak of the role of women in influencing or not influencing decisions to go to war? And Jan Ferguson, a similar question, how different would negotiations to prevent war be if there were more women around the table?
Okay, well, I'll do the second one first. I do have an answer to that one. When people say, would we get as many wars and would we get more peace if women were in charge? And I say, my brief answer is Catherine the Great, Maria Theresa, Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi. In other words, women can, as heads of state, can be every bit as involved and engaged in wars as men can be. I mean, I think women are not necessarily more peaceful and nicer than men. Women's involvement in war is very interesting, and there has not, I think, yet been enough written on it. I mean, research is now being done, but for a long time it was wars. People who studied war tended to look at those who did the actual fighting. But increasingly, of course, we have women engaged in wars. We always have had. We've had women as guerrillas, we've had women, and it now looks as though the Amazons actually existed, that they were not just a figment of the Greeks' imagination. And women have sometimes disguised themselves and gone to war. But you had, in the Second World War, you had Soviet women fighting as fighter pilots, as snipers, in other words, fighting on the front lines, doing the same sorts of things men were doing. And a number of armies today, and militaries today generally, have men and women in combat roles. They bear equal responsibility. So that women can be as warlike as men, or they can participate in wars like men. They often, of course, are often the victims of war. There's a particular tragedy, I think, that happens to women, and that is that sexual violence, rape, for example, is used as an instrument of war, not just to reward the victorious military, but also to break the spirit of those who are fighting. In Bosnia, when that unfortunate land fell to pieces, the Serb militia would rape Bosnian Muslim women and say, now you have to bear a Serbian child. It was a very deliberate attempt, I think, to crush the spirit of the Bosnians, and it happened to the Yazidi in the north of Syria and Iraq, and it's happened to others. It's happening today in Ukraine. I think the Russians are using rape, sexual violence more generally, as an instrument of trying to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people, but also simply because they don't think there's anything wrong with it. They don't try and control their own soldiers. So women are often the victims of war. But there's a third way, and women too often have opposed war. Women's groups, the Greenham Common women, for example, have often taken the lead in pacifism, trying to oppose war, trying to resist war. But there is also a way in which women have supported war. So that's, women are not just victims. They're not just sometimes unwilling participants. They're not just sometimes those who are trying to oppose war, but you also get women who are cheerleaders for war, who think war is good, who encourage the men to go off and fight. And you think of the women in the First World War with the white feathers, who gave the white feather the symbol of cowardice to any man of military age who wasn't in uniform. And so, in other words, we're like all human beings. We're not one thing or the other. We have some who are pro-war, some who are against war, some who cheerlead for war, some who are victims of war.
I'm going to move into the area of Ukraine and Russia. We've got an awful lot of questions. Nuclear first. So, Ian Watson, is it not ironic that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons for guarantees, etc., only to be attacked by Russia? Will this make any future nuclear disarmament by countries even harder to achieve? And a quite different question, but on the same issue. How serious do you think is Putin's talk of a nuclear solution? How could this possibly be a winning gambit for him?
We don't know about Putin, but he's been threatening nuclear escalation right from the beginning. And it is difficult, I think, to gauge his mental state and know what he's thinking. He's surrounded by a very small group of people. He lives, I think, in considerable isolation. He may have become even more isolated and more fixed in his ideas during COVID. It's suggested that he was very, very strange during COVID. I think if you wanted to see him, you had to wait for a week and be sprayed with some disinfectant every 5 minutes and have your blood tested and so on. So some of those who are close to him are very scary ideologues, or people who tell him exactly what he wants to hear. He's got the fatal thing, I think, that dictators often get, and that is they begin to believe their own publicity, and they begin to think they're always infallible. So will he use nuclear weapons? I think unlikely. He's threatened it a lot, and he hasn't done it. He said just a couple of days ago that the Americans have now escalated it with providing access to these new rocket launchers and rockets, which they've already provided them to Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians can now fire them into Russian territory. He would be risking retaliation. It's it would be a real gamble, and we don't know how much of a gambler he is. But yes, I feel Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return. It was one of the chief centers of the Russian nuclear deterrent, which is why if Ukraine chose to get nuclear weapons again, it would have a head start. But Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for the Budapest Agreement, in which those that signed it, including Russia, promised to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. And you can see why Ukraine might never trust anything that Putin's Russia or Putin and Russia say again. So I think, yes, other nations will look at this and think we're not giving up our nuclear weapons. And what pressure can we put on them? North Korea only has its nuclear weapons. It's an impoverished little backwater in the world. Its people, apart from the dear leader himself, who seems to be the only person in North Korea who gets anything to eat. But the rest, North Korea is often on the edge of starvation. It's a miserable society. It has nothing much else going for it. But it has nuclear weapons. And so why would he give them up? It is about the only thing that keeps him as a player in the world and keeps him in power. So yes, I think it is. And what will be difficult too is I think, this isn't a question you asked, but other nations may well go down the road of getting nuclear weapons. And that is worrying. Iran, I think, was close to it. I think the recent attacks by Israel have probably delayed that. But there are other possibilities. It's apparently the technology is, I don't know enough about it, but the technology, it's known how to refine the fuel you need. It's known how to prepare a nuclear bomb. What is more difficult are the means of delivering, but there seem to be many willing nations ready to sell rockets which can deliver nuclear weapons these days.
I'm going to ask a question that possibly qualifies for the finale question, but I'm going to do it at this stage because it's about Ukraine. Vivian puts it one way: in the light of your talk, what strategies would you advise to Ukraine and the West, and even to Putin, for both to achieve a win-win? Jane puts it differently: how would you propose to bring about peace in Ukraine and win the Nobel Peace Prize at the same time?
Well, that will be left to Donald Trump, who wants the Nobel Peace Prize. No, he's decided it's the one bauble that he doesn't have, so he's very keen to get it. I think, I don't know how peace is going to come in Ukraine. I think there will be a point at which, for both sides, some sort of agreement is probably going to be better than the current situation. I mean, Russia probably has taken more losses, but then it has a bigger population than Ukraine. Ukraine is running out of people who can fight. I mean, they've got people who can fight, but people who want to fight, they're beginning to run out of it. I think there is a war weariness in Ukraine. We don't know if there's a war weariness in Russia, and Putin has very carefully kept the big cities and people who live in the big cities insulated from a lot of the effects of the war. I mean, if you look at those who've been doing the fighting for Russia, they've tended to come from the ethnic minorities, they've come from the Far East, they've come from the prisons. Apparently they've had to close a lot of prison camps in Siberia because they don't have enough people to fill them anymore because they've been sent off to the front. Or they are those who Putin has effectively bought, like the North Koreans, and like some of the peoples from I think he has peoples from Africa fighting there. I think he has had, I don't know if they're Gurkhas, but he certainly had Nepalese fighting on the front lines who came thinking apparently they were going to get a nice job in a Russian city and found themselves on the front lines with Ukraine. So I think war weariness, we don't know, may not be as great in Russia as it is in Ukraine, which is a more open society. It will depend, I think, on how much pressure the outside powers can put on. And China, I think, is probably key here because it could put pressure on Russia. And China, I think, has come out of this very much with the upper hand. Russia has weakened itself. It's more dependent on China, which is, I think, not a position that a lot of Russians would like. But I think it has happened. Whether China can put sufficient pressure on Russia to come to some sort of agreement. And the question then is, and what the United States will do. I mean, Trump has said that he will solve it on day one of his being president. So I suggest you don't plan a big celebration on that day. But you can celebrate his being made president, but I wouldn't plan a big celebration for the peace in Ukraine. So we don't know whether or, but I think, if there could be some sort of agreement that Ukraine would get a guarantee from NATO, even become a member of NATO, that Russia would keep, I think Russia will keep Ukraine almost for sure. And I'm not sure Ukraine would want it back. Crimea, rather. I don't think Ukraine would want Crimea back because it's 90% Russians, not just Russian speakers. A lot of Ukrainians are Russian speakers, but they're Ukrainian nationalists, patriots. But I think Crimea, it has a lot of retired Russian military there. It would not be a comfortable bit of territory for Ukraine to try and rule over. And Russia would probably want to keep parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, the territories that it took in 2014. What good that will do them, I don't know. They've been so fought over and the infrastructure is so damaged, it's difficult to tell. But there might be some sort of compromise where Ukraine sacrifices land. But would Ukraine sacrifice land without some sort of guarantee against a renewed Russian attack? I think they'd be crazy to. You can't rely on what Putin says he'll do. I mean, there's just no way. And if he says, oh, we'll never attack again, I mean, words are extremely cheap. In Putin's case, he will find some excuse to attack. But if Ukraine gets a guarantee from NATO, becomes a member of NATO, then it might deter Russia. And we think of how much Russia is a menace for Ukraine, but Ukraine plus Poland, plus the Scandinavian countries and the Baltic states, are actually a threat to Russia as well. Russia has produced in Ukraine a battle-hardened army, much more experienced in war than it was when the war started. It's got a Poland which is vehemently opposed to Russia and is spending a great deal on weapons. Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. So Russia has brought about a much stronger Western presence on its border as a result of its invasion in Ukraine. So it may think twice about doing anything more. Very, very difficult to tell. I mean, I think we all hope that there will be some sort of compromise and some sort of peace, but how it's going to be achieved and who's going to play a role is going to be difficult at the moment to see. But clearly, it seems to me China has to play a role, and the US has to play some sort of role. Whether the European Union can and Britain can is another matter.
Thank you for all your questions about Russia, Ukraine. There were more. I need to move on. Now, Middle East, we've got a number of thoughts there. And so some of them are about the ICC ruling arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant Mohammed Dave for war crimes. And so Julia Ibbotson and Sue wonder whether this will have any effect moving towards peace in the region. Richard Tadman puts it quite differently. How will history judge Netanyahu, a decisive and strong leader or a war criminal? And just to round it off, if you could just hold that thought, that specific, Sid Goodman puts a broader question. Are some wars like Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah an inevitable culmination of the history of the region?
I never think that things are a culmination of the previous history. I think they're made possible by the previous history, but I think they're a result of decisions made by individuals at the time. And I think the decision made by Hamas to attack Israel was one that could have not been made. Certainly, there was bitterness among the Palestinians about what Israel has been doing in Gaza, about the blockade effectively on Gaza, about the confinement of the people of Gaza in that very small bit of territory. A great deal of bitterness still over what's happened in the West Bank. Some will never forgive the establishment of the State of Israel. But I think it was Hamas, not all the Palestinian people, who after all have been as much oppressed by Hamas as anyone else. Hamas was, I think, elected in Gaza, I think it was 2006, and there's never been a free election since. And the people of Gaza have been oppressed by Hamas. And if you fall out, if you're one of the many categories of people Hamas doesn't trust, including gays, your life in Gaza has been pretty awful if you haven't been executed. So I don't think what happened was a necessary result of the way in which the Palestinians had been treated. I think it was a result of a decision by Hamas, which are, I think, moved by really what's a 19th century European revolutionary idea that if you bring about enough oppression, the people will rise up and overthrow those who are oppressing them. And so I think the idea was that Israel would retaliate so strongly that all the Palestinians would rise up and that would be the end of Israel. It was a hideous miscalculation which has led to partial destruction of Hamas, which I can't say I mourn at all, but it's led to tremendous suffering for the Palestinians, in whose name Hamas claimed to speak, and I don't think it did always speak in their name. Netanyahu, as a war criminal, will he ever be tried? I think highly unlikely. He simply doesn't, he won't appear before the International Criminal Court. But it is, I think, an indication of the way in which opinion is beginning to turn against Israel. Although I note that one of the leaders of Hamas, I can't remember what the name was also charged in the same charge sheet. So I think there's an attempt there to be, not just focusing on Israel. But I do think the way in which the war has gone on, the fact that Netanyahu doesn't seem to have any clear idea of how he wants it to end, that there are those in his government who now talk about annexing the West Bank. There are certainly those in his government who are talking about clearing North Gaza, if not the whole of Gaza, of Palestinians and making it part of Israel again. So, I think Netanyahu doesn't seem to have a clear picture of how it will end. And I think that is where he's not been a good leader for Israel, because if you start something like a war, then you have to have some sense of how you're going to end it and what you want. Now, there was a third question, which I've now forgotten.
No, I think that you've covered that thing, actually, if you don't mind, because I'd like to ask a lot more questions, and I'd like to move you on to Graham Daly's question, which is actually a bit of an awkward one, unless you've got some history books with you. He says, when was the last war where the aggressor succeeded in their aims, and that result has lasted ever since? And what, if anything, does this tell us?
The last war where the aggressor succeeded in their aims? Well, not since the Second World War, I don't think. But certainly, if Russia succeeds in detaching part of Ukraine, it will have succeeded in its... But it won't have succeeded in its overall aim of destroying Ukraine.
No, but the aggressors in the Second World War didn't succeed?
Well, actually, the Soviet Union, because Stalin and Hitler did a deal, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, in the summer of 1939, in which it was a defensive pact, but it had the famous secret clauses, which said that they would divide up the center of Europe between them, and that Russia would take more or less the eastern part of Poland, and Germany would take the western part, and that Russia would dominate in the Baltics, in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia eventually, and Germany would I think, dominate in part of Romania. It was a disgraceful deal. It was secret, but it eventually came out. And Russia did invade Poland after Germany had already defeated it. I think invaded in October 1939. It did invade the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and it hung on to those until the end of the Cold War, and it still has the territories which are now part of Belarus, but that's basically a Russian satellite. Poland effectively moved about 200 miles westwards, and that territory has never gone back to Poland. Part of what was Polish territory is now in Ukraine, part is in Belarus. And so, yes, I think that was perhaps the last big example I can think of where an aggressor, in this case the Soviet Union, didn't give back what it had taken, even when it became an ally of Britain, which had gone into the war to defend Poland, and an ally of the United States, which believed in self-determination. Stalin made it perfectly clear he wasn't going to give back that territory.
I'd like to pick up something from your talk through Richard Moulton's question. So he's wondering whether certain societies, like Western Europe today, which are prosperous and comfortable, whether they have too much to lose in the event of war, leading to appeasement. By contrast, the USA is almost immune from anything other than nuclear attack. Would you like to explore that with us briefly?
Well, we know that appeasement didn't turn out to be a very good idea in the 1930s, that if you're dealing with those whose appetites are large, the more you give them, the bigger the appetite is likely to get. And so I think, my own feeling is it would be a very big mistake for European countries to try and deal with Russia, be friendly with Russia. Some are already trying. Orban's Hungary is, Slovakia is, I think. But I think that those would be very big mistakes, because it does not going to make Russia treat you any more kindly. It didn't make Hitler treat the democracies any more kindly. It simply convinced him they were weak. The USA, I don't think, is immune from attack now. They were until very recently. I mean, in the Second World War, I think something like, David Reynolds, the historian, always quotes this figure, and it's something like 30 Americans were killed by enemy attacks on the on the soil of the continental US. And that was when the Japanese sent fire balloons across, which set some of the West Coast forests on fire, and a few people were killed by those fires. And its geography has always protected the United States, but long-range aircraft began to dent that vulnerability, and now, of course, rockets have dented it. But the United States is also vulnerable to cyber war, as we all are, because we are so dependent now on cyber. We're so dependent on the internet. And every day there are reports of unexplained outages. Something suddenly goes down, a system goes down. And the United States has suffered such attacks. A whole water treatment plant nearly went off the rails when false orders were fed in. So I think the United States can no longer see itself as immune to attack from outside. I think, like the rest of us, it's vulnerable. I mean, I live in a very, very big country, Canada, with a very small population, but we are not immune to attack. I mean, it won't be the case of people coming in ships and getting off and invading, I think, so much as it will be attacks on our infrastructure, attacks on our ability to manage our societies, and disinformation. The spread of disinformation, I mean, misinformation is just getting it wrong as far as I can see. Disinformation is deliberately telling lies. And the spread of this has been absolutely spectacularly, terrifyingly enormous in the last few months, in the last few years. I mean, the involvement of disinformation in the American elections, in Brexit, in elections in Canada. I mean, this is something that is being used as a weapon by states like Russia. And Russia and states like Iran are increasingly using criminal gangs. They're hiring people, guns for hire, to pick off their enemies, to assassinate them. And so that we are, I think, we're not invulnerable anymore. We are not immune from attack. It's just they're different sorts of attacks than we might have thought of in the past.
Just a few more questions in the time available. Here's an intriguing one, I think, from Ian Duadoff. In this modern, highly technical world, and we've been talking about the nuclear weapons and the impact that can have, destructive potential, but he says spying is more and more effective. If nations know what others are doing, so there's no secrets, does that make the world a safer place and prevent war?
Well, I think, sometimes thought that. And during the sort of period of détente in the Cold War in the 1970s, when things did relax, some of the arms agreements, the very effective ones, limiting intercontinental ballistic missiles, for example, did provide for inspection, that each side could send teams of inspectors to look at any sites they wanted to in the other country. And you could argue that was actually good. And the same thing was happening with Iran when it was sanctioned previously, and it was having to have teams of UN inspectors come in and look at its nuclear installations, which I think probably was a good thing. I'm not sure we do know more about each other. I think there are many sources of information, but some states are still very successful in keeping secrets. And the Chinese have got firewalls around China, and Chinese citizens will try and find ways of getting information from outside, and as soon as the Chinese authorities find out, and they have a huge apparatus to do this, as soon as they find out, they block that particular avenue. The Russian people are not getting much news from outside. They don't really know what's going on in the Ukraine war, for example. So I think I think you're probably right, that the more we know about each other in a way, the better, but it's very hard to persuade nations of that. They would much rather guard their secrets very carefully. And sometimes we have things that we don't want others to know. We don't want them to know if our defenses aren't in good order. We don't want them to know that we're having problems with a particular type of weapon or a particular type of technology. So it's complicated. I think the most successful spying, in my view, is not the sort of cloak and dagger people so much as it's just the intelligence that comes through, human intelligence, about what the people on the other side are like and what they're thinking. Because I do think, again, we really need to know what they're thinking and what they're feeling and what they're likely to do.
Some final words about leadership, on which I know you've written a great deal. Jonathan Dannett says Blair and Bush reduced the credibility of the UN, which Putin has utilized. So how do we rebuild the UN? Chris Nibbs was hoping you'd talk a little bit more about the role of leaders in modern wars, but we just got time for a few quick thoughts.
Nice short question.
Well, you've written, you wrote a rather long book about that, didn't you?
Well, I am interested in it. I think, yes, I think the UN lost a lot of credibility, and so did the West more generally when the coalition invaded Iraq. I think at the time people thought Saddam Hussein is a dreadful person, and Iraq would be better off without him as its leader. But then it turned out that the grounds for invading Iraq were not true. And I think that lost a lot of moral authority. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no very good evidence that he was building anything of the sort. And I think then the mess and the muddle that the coalition made of its occupation of Iraq did not encourage people to think that the West always knew best. I don't think it did. The unfortunate people of Iraq, who we have tended to forget about, have had, I think the latest calculation is well over 500,000 casualties. And they still have a very unstable and shaky situation. They still have a civil war going on. And so I think we have, as a part of the world, lost credibility. And unfortunately, the whole notion of humanitarian intervention has very much been discredited. The idea that you intervene in another state to try and save the people of that state. It hasn't turned out very well. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the nations we keep on changing our terminology, but the global south is the current one at the moment. We used to call it the third world, or we used to call it the developing world. The global south isn't geographically accurate because a lot of the nations in the global south are actually in the north. But you do get a feeling that why should they care about Ukraine? The West's hands are not so clean that they can afford to take a high moral stand here. I think it's striking that South Africa, for example, a lot of African nations have not supported the West on this, and I do think there's a feeling that we have lost our moral credibility. And I think the second part of the question is, how do we rebuild it? Was that?
Yes, if you got a few words, thoughts on that?
Well, we need leadership, and I know it was about leaders, and I do think leaders can matter. I mean, I'd rather live in times in a country where it actually doesn't matter who's your prime minister. I'd rather live in a peaceful time where you could have, someone whose name you barely remember as prime minister, but who doesn't cause any trouble. I don't want to live in a world with great leaders because they often cause all sorts of trouble. I mean, as what I was saying earlier, they become convinced that they're always right, which doesn't mean we haven't had great people as leaders, but I do think we also have had some people who have been absolutely appalling, and once they get their hands on the levers of power, it can be very difficult to dislodge them. And yes, they do make a difference. I think if Hitler had been killed in the trenches in the First World War, we wouldn't have had quite what we had with Nazi Germany, and we wouldn't have Germany making war in the way that it did, or perhaps going to war at all. If someone other than Mao Zedong had been head of China, head of the Chinese Communist Party, I don't think he would have had the absolute horrors of the Great Leap Forward, the killing of the landlords, the Great Cultural Revolution. He killed more of the Chinese people than the Japanese did. And China, I think, still bears the scars of that. So I think sometimes who's in power, particularly if they have a great deal of power, is very important, and they can inflict awful damage on their own societies, and have done so. And to go back to Putin, yes, I think if someone other would have still have been an unpleasant person, probably someone from the KGB or one of the former intelligence services, but they might not have caused quite as much damage as Putin has done. Very difficult to tell, but I do think sometimes individual leaders do make a great difference.
I don't know whether it lightens the atmosphere, but it's the final question put by possibly the youngest person amongst us. She's been quite troubled by what she's heard tonight. So where is safe, she says, given the potential expansion and the fallout of all these current wars? So where should she go and live? The Caribbean? What suggestions have you got to make?
Okay, well, in Canada, but we are vulnerable because we sit on so much of the world's, the second biggest country in the world, and we sit on huge raw materials and resources. And we have a very small armed forces, smaller than Britain's, I think, which is saying something these days. So, I think you could go to New Zealand, but then you'd find a lot of dot-com billionaires who bought up chunks of it. You'd probably meet Elon Musk there. So I'm not sure. You could go with Musk and co to Mars when they finally go. I'm not sure I'd recommend that either. The idea of living in a sort of dome on Mars with a bunch of quarreling dot-com billionaires isn't appealing. So I can't recommend anywhere terribly good. I mean, you could go. There was a Canadian who thought that World War III was going to come and took his wife and child to what he thought was probably the safest place in the world. It was called the Falkland Islands. So I'm not sure. Guessing is never easy.
There we must end it. I hope you agree with me. This was such a fascinating exploration, taken us away perhaps from the specifics of the current war and made us think more broadly. Who else but our Honorary President to stretch our minds tonight? And I'd like to thank her so much for being our Honorary President, for supporting us in so many other ways that not all of you are aware of. It's wonderful to have her here in person. Thank you so much for this evening, Margaret MacMillan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.